On his return from the campaign of Austerlitz, the emperor could not help noticing a void in the rooms adjoining his cabinet. His aides-de-camp, now become important personages, no longer rushed to seat themselves at the desks provided for them. General Clark himself, launched into high positions, had just fulfilled the functions of governor of Vienna, and was further and further from the routine of his former post. The Emperor Napoleon had near him no one but Meneval, and nevertheless 6 years' worth of state papers had accumulated with no order to them, and the even larger mass of petitions threatened to engulf them. It was urgent to weed out the inessential in order to expedite current affairs. Additionally, it was to be feared that the rigorous demands to which the secretary was subjected would prove to be too much for one man's strength. The emperor could no longer put off providing Meneval with assistance. For more than a year, 2 positions of cabinet secretary had figured in the House accounts. In creating these posts, Napoleon had intended to arrange honorific titles for the counselors of state and the lieutenant generals he had occasion to entrust with some particular task. General Clark held the title of one of these positions. The second had not yet been given to anyone, and in fact, both could be considered vacant. But they were established in relation to the cabinet rather than from within it, and the emperor still attached great importance to maintaining these honorary positions and not confusing them with the real and useful tasks that his personal service required. To help Meneval when he was overloaded with work, and even to replace him in the event of illness or forced absence, actual secretaries were needed, professionals, certain, precise, proven, and if possible, men whose faces would not be too unfamiliar in the inner chambers. So the emperor looked around him and settled on 2 men who were already virtually under his nose. Monsieur Deschamps, who was on the ground floor of the palace, carried out the duties of secretary to the empress's commands, and Monsieur Fain, division head of the office of the Secretary of State, whom he had known since year 3, and whom he had just observed on the journeys to the Bologna coast, Belgium, and the banks of the Rhine, the coronation in Italy, and the Austerlitz campaign. Monsieur Deschamps was given the title of petition holder. He took his place at the head that the aide-de-camp Duroc, now Grand Marshal of the Palace, had left vacant, but his work barely extended beyond the sorting of petitions, and the bulk of this job, the analysis and referrals. He remained a stranger to the papers of state. He did not follow the cabinet in war campaigns, and the emperor ended by forgetting to approach him, either because he did not find his pen swift enough in dictation, or because his other position as secretary to the empress's commands posed certain restrictions, or yet again because his age and the severity of his manner rendered him less suitable for intimate work. Monsieur Deschamps spent his leisure time translating the Italian poem of Monti, entitled The Black Forest Band, into French. At the time of the divorce, he definitively ceased to be a part of the cabinet and followed Josephine, to whom he would remain attached until the moment of her death. Monsieur Fain had more success. He had just put in order the archives of the Secretariat of State, which included those of the Directoire and the National Security Committee. The emperor gave him the care of his papers. Monsieur Meneval was to give them all to him, day by day, even the most confidential. Meneval was entrusted with secrets in the day, Fain by night. Because of this special situation, he held the title of Secretary archivist. The room where he first set up his boxes was that which General Clark had occupied, the dispatches he classified, the notes he kept of all that had just been written soon initiated him. The emperor got in the habit of dictating to him, confiding various particulars to him to follow up on, such as the examination of the secret accounts of the police, foreign relations, and the coffers, the list of endowments, etc. He took him on his trips and on his campaigns and saw no more in him than his habitual lieutenant and the necessary assistant to Meneval. This last could not remain without a title when newcomers who were merely his assistants received them by the decree of February 3rd, 1806, which named Fain Secretary Archivist. Meneval received the title of Secretary of the Portfolio by the decree of April 25th of that year, naming Fain a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. Meneval finally received this same decoration. These two secretaries were sufficient for the internal cabinet work during the campaigns of Vienna and Poland, and during the Spanish campaign of 1808. On his return from Spain, the emperor turned again to the idea he had once had of creating two positions of cabinet secretaries, apart from his habitual private ones. But time had modified his views. It was no longer a question of summoning already formed statesmen to fill them. The emperor found it more convenient to reserve these posts for young men with expectations whom he could keep at hand for assignments, whom in the meantime he would keep busy with special commissions, and who would thus be formed under his eyes. The first that the emperor chose was Monsieur Mounier, son of the former constituent who, under the empire, had been prefect of Rennes and a councillor of state. Since the death of his father, this young man, as well as his sister, received a pension from Napoleon's personal endowment list. He owed to this sort of adoption the favor that sought him out among the rank of auditors and to the council of state and set him apart. The second post of cabinet secretary was given 2 years later to Monsieur de Ponton, a lieutenant general of engineering who had been attached to our Russian embassy and who had been recommended for important missions by the confidence of the Duke of Vicenza. Caulaincourt, Mounier, and de Ponton were not usually admitted to the privacy of the cabinet, but their neighboring position and distinguished personal merit made them, under many circumstances, extremely useful aids. Their daily occupation was the endless work of the petitions. Monsieur Mounier, who knew German and English very well, was in addition entrusted with overseeing the translation of foreign newspapers, and this secondary work was of vital interest to the emperor. For him, it was a useful means of listening to the enemy and each day viewing his political position from the other side. Often, when he had just been given newspapers still damp with salt water from the smugglers, he would call Mounier to translate them out before him, impatient to get an immediate idea of what they contained. 5 or 6 translators working under Mounier translated at leisure. The emperor preferred their translations to the versions that the ministers of foreign relations and the police each prepared for him on their own. In 1812, finding himself engaged in battle in the Russian Empire, the emperor felt the need of having with him at all times an interpreter who could question prisoners and natives, as well as translate the documents that were intercepted. Therefore, he created the position of interpreter secretary and gave it to the auditor Lelorgne de Villa, who spoke both Russian and German. Lelorgne mounted on horseback at Vitebsk, and from there on never left the emperor. The rigors of the retreat from Moscow and all the difficult campaigns following it led to one final alteration in the cabinet arrangements. Monsieur Meneval, whom the emperor had left very ill on his departure from Smorgoni, found himself forced to retire at that time. Monsieur de Ponton, who had been summoned to Hamburg by a superior commander of his engineering unit, had remained there. Between the retirement of one and the absence of the other, there resulted a split. The titles of Secretary of the Portfolio and Secretary Archivist were dropped, and the jobs were called by their actual names. Monsieur Fain, who through these events had become first secretary, took the title of Secretary of the Cabinet, and Monsieur Mounier, who already held this title, took over his functions. Thus, for some time, again, there were two secretaries of the cabinet. As assistants, the emperor granted them two first clerks, Juin and Provost. The former was one of the most distinguished employees in the Secretariat of State, well versed in the art of writing as quickly as the spoken word and learned in both English and German. The latter had been the embassy secretary of the Duke of Vicenza, Caulaincourt, and General Lauriston at St. Petersburg. Both returned to Moscow. This cabinet followed the emperor at the outset of the campaign of 1813, but during the Dresden armistice, Mounier and Provost, unable to bear up any longer under the sufferings of war, returned to France. By the emperor's generosity, Monsieur Mounier obtained the position of steward of the imperial buildings, and Monsieur Provost became Secretary General of the official seals. So the emperor had only Monsieur Fain and Monsieur Juin left to him. Monsieur Fain alone remained cabinet secretary, and the job of first clerk left vacant by Monsieur Provost was given to Monsieur de Rumigny, a former legation secretary employed for some time on the banks of the Elbe as French minister to Dessau. The emperor had just noticed his correspondence. This was the makeup of the cabinet at the time of the 1814 catastrophe. We have not yet spoken of the map room. This is the name the emperor gave to an adjoining room with an extremely large table where maps and drawings were spread out. In Paris during the final years, this huge table filled the center of the room the emperor passed through to reach the bedroom in his cabinet. In the palaces at St. Cloud, Compiègne, Rambouillet, and Fontainebleau, during journeys as well as on campaigns, the map room was always nearby. Bachelor d'Alba, who had been the geographical engineer attached to General Bonaparte in Italy, returned to this post in 1806 under the Emperor Napoleon. He was then named commanding warrant officer and head of the topographical office. Later, he had as assistants two geographical engineers who kept order in the collection of maps, and in addition did all the drafting work for the emperor's personal use. D'Alba was called when the emperor wished to chart war dispatches on a map. With red or black pins, D'Alba would indicate the sites occupied by our troops and by those of the enemy. He would then mark in different colors the rivers, mountains, and borders pertaining to the question at hand. Lastly, he calculated distances, placing the scale in a prominent position and leaving the compass to one side. The dispatched information thus having been superimposed on the map, the emperor could examine it closely. D'Alba gave him a brief summary. The emperor followed it with his finger and steered the compass towards the pins. Often, the large dimensions of the map forced the emperor to stretch out at full length over the table, and D'Alba climbed up too from his side to protect the map. More than once, I saw them both stretched out over this large table, fully absorbed in their work, exclaiming abruptly when they suddenly bumped heads. This posture could not have been more ridiculous, but for picturing at that moment the emperor hovering like an eagle over the faraway plains where his lieutenants were maneuvering unseen by any eye but his own. During the campaign of 1814, Monsieur D'Alba had as assistant Colonel Attilan, who finally replaced him when the state of his health forced him in turn to leave the army at La Ferté-sur-Jouarre. Some days prior to the Battle of Craonne, Monsieur d'Alba, promoted in 1813 to the rank of general, went to Paris to take charge of the war coffers. We have produced the comings and goings in the cabinet until the final period. Now let us return to the emperor, who is the only true figure in this mysterious establishment. All those we have just glimpsed are but passing shadows. The moment his light ceases to illuminate them. Chapter 5. The day's first labors. It was never later than 8 in the morning when Napoleon, dressed for the rest of the day, went into his cabinet. At his entrance, the secretary rose, remained standing a moment, and then returned to his place. First, Napoleon sat at his desk to sign papers. He found before him, in a foolscap folder, under the heading "To Sign," the letters and orders that he had dictated during his previous work session. He rarely signed without reading them, and his most important letters bear this out by the additions and deletions in his hand which cover them. After signing, he would rise and go to toss the folder on the secretary's table, saying to him, "Send these." Then go over to the fireplace to read the night's dispatches and the morning's correspondence. He found them arranged in a stack on the pedestal table near the settee, where he habitually sat, and had soon read through them. The Prince of Neuchâtel, Berthier, the Minister of War, and the Minister of Foreign Relations were in the habit of communicating to him that which was of interest in their previous day's correspondence, either via the original or by extract. If a word of response or a command would suffice, he dictated it once by note or in the form of a letter. As soon as he passed from one piece of paper to the next, the letter which he had responded to or which required no answer slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. This is how he disposed of the papers he had no need to see again. What he threw on the floor was turned answered. He kept on the table the stack of matters he intended to take care of later in the day. This was current. Another stack was made up of folders he saved to look at when his mind was fresh or at a later time. This was called pending. The emperor himself had established this practical division of papers, and the arrangement never varied. After this initial period given to opening dispatches and letters from the ministers, the emperor looked through his police bulletins. There were various kinds, those of the Ministry of Police, those of headquarters, those of the military police, and finally the reports of a policeman paid 500 francs a month out of a private account. These bulletins did not always contain what one might suppose. When the emperor was in Paris, the minister-in-chief of police saved what was most secret or of most piquant interest for the audience they were granted each morning at the levee. The ministry bulletin offered a monotonous enough inventory of crimes, disasters, fires, and accidents whose reports the mail coaches of the previous day had brought from all corners of the empire. Normally, the minister added to this notes in his handwriting or that of his private secretary on loose sheets of paper, which the emperor, after having read, would get rid of if he deemed it appropriate. The report of the police chief described the previous night's events and so received the most attention at the moment. General Hulot's bulletin was limited to garrison matters and the military population which passed through the streets of Paris, the strength of the corps, the number of men they had in the hospitals, the name of arriving or departing generals, the brawls, and comments about the good or bad quality provisions or supplies were the usual subjects of this bulletin. As for the privately paid policeman, perhaps it is, according to him, too much importance to even have mentioned him. He was the least significant of all the reports, wherein could be found remarks about the public squares, bridges, quays, and taverns. The Observer, a former battalion head, had been with the military police in Paris during the early period of the domestic army in the year 3. And the Emperor Napoleon's generosity aided General Bonaparte's former employee in this manner. Moreover, the emperor found a way to put to good use even the least interesting of these reports, particularly in a manner hostile towards the police. Forced to use such services, he felt at the very least obligated to keep close rein on them so that power was not abused for the sake of private interests. Despotic actions drew more vehement reprimands from him than negligence or incompetence. I remember, among others, a letter that I wrote under his dictation in which the Duc de Rovigo, Savary, would certainly recall, as it was addressed to him. The emperor had just learned from a bulletin that an individual had been thrown in prison unnecessarily in defiance of legal procedures and on the orders of a police department employee. The emotion he experienced was indignation, and never were the rights of personal liberty better defended than by Napoleon himself in this letter of reprimand to the minister. On this occasion, he made a declaration of faith so notable that I wish I could recall the words. As it is, I can only give the meaning. You must not forget, he said to the Duke of Rovigo, that in ordinary affairs it is only magistrates who can issue arrest warrants against a citizen. And if by authority of my dictatorship you possess this right, know well, it is only in extremely rare cases of political intrigue or urgent necessity. And even so, you must account to me immediately for any action outside the law. But it was never my intention that such a right could extend to your inferiors. Perhaps it is too much already that I should extend them to you. Perhaps it is too much that I haven't exercised them myself. In extraordinary times, some extraordinary powers are necessary. But if in trust I have given you a weapon for my defense, you alone must make use of it, and you will answer to me for the abuses that others make of it. At the same time, that the emperor appreciated at its true worth the pieces of information the police procured for him each morning, he drew others from a more mysterious source, where the persons he had reason to keep under surveillance came themselves unknowingly to reveal their passions, their intrigues, their plots, and their weaknesses. The secrets of the post, enclosed in a small portfolio of red Moroccan letter and disguised under the inscription foreign newspapers, passed in their turn under the emperor's eyes. This magic mirror was an old furnishing of the French cabinet. It had been introduced in the time of Louis XIV to take shrewd diplomats by surprise at the moment when they believed themselves the most inscrutable. This violation of the postal seal was undoubtedly a sacrilege, but of the sort which pontiffs allow themselves to commit. And it is well known that it is still done in the major post office of Europe under a ruler like Louis XV, more interested in trivial affairs than important ones. The police did not hesitate to share with politicians the fruits of his secret perspective. Louis XVI, who had inherited the system from his grandfather, wanted at least to clean it up by entrusting it to the integrity of Monsieur Donny, the National Secretary. Security Committee picked it up from the rubble of August 10th and made use of it, as dismantled as it was, to track down counter-revolutionary correspondence. The Directoire wanted to try it for diplomatic surveillance, and Monsieur Gaudin, the postmaster, was put in charge of getting the erstwhile cabinet back on its feet. The institution was at first paid for by means of a levy that the cashiers of the Foreign Relations Department and the police were ordered to pay every month out of their secret expenses, and which they gave to a third party who alone knew the use of the funds. For some years, I was the third party. So the postal cabinet was reestablished and operating at full force when Napoleon inherited it from the Republic. But what mirror can be useful if it is not accurate? It is not even enough for it to be that. The person making use of it must harbor no doubts in this regard. Napoleon did not consider it too high a price to pay for this precious guarantee to deprive himself of the military services of his aide-de-camp, Lavalette, so that he could devote himself henceforward to this confidential and delicate ministry. Napoleon appreciated it as such to the point of saying one day that, in this proceeding, all that was not excused for reasons of state remained a crime. In Paris, a method long in use but invisible was employed to skillfully intercept at the moment of sorting not only the letters of the foreign ministers but also those of their subordinates, who were known to be good sources of information. What a minister was too careful to write was often revealed in the correspondence of the valet, the secretary, or even the banker. From the sorting desk, these letters were quickly taken to a private examination room, which communicated with the post office only by a secret door. There to open shrewdly, glean what was relevant, and reseal the envelope took only a moment, and the dispatch soon returned to circulation, having scarcely been detoured on its way. In vain the wiles of envelopes, seals, and codes exhausted themselves attempting to avoid such unwelcome surprises. The school in the Rue Coq-Héron knew how to foil all tricks. It was familiar with chemical techniques, the sciences of mathematical probability and grammatical analysis supplied it with proven deciphering methods. It was no less skilled at removing fingerprints, softening wax, and reclosing it with a facsimile of the seal than at solving the most elusive codes with the help of time and study. Each discovery of this sort carried its bonus of encouragement. Employment in this office for the most part passed from father to son. Their position was ordinarily disguised in the world by some fictitious job title in accordance with the comfortable income they enjoyed, which prevented anyone from suspecting the real work they were engaged in. The young called on to inherit this legacy were educated with care. Nothing was neglected. Journeys during which the state supported them at great expense in foreign countries, learning to familiarize themselves with the popular idioms of each language as well as with the most difficult foreign scripts and the commonest abbreviations. These special studies were pursued unknown even to the ambassadors under the cloak of banking, commerce, or diplomacy. It was another language school for the young. However, the existence of the postal cabinet had not been a secret for some time to all those well-versed in political affairs. The great powers only had to consider what they did at home to imagine what was being done in Paris. The first instruction their ambassadors received was an order to entrust nothing to the post. All their important communications went by way of special courier, but a subordinate level of diplomats not sufficiently wealthy to make use of this resource believed they could continue to use the post by employing codes. These obstinate code writers were perhaps the best and most abundant catch of our pirates. Lesser diplomats live in proximity to greater ones, and though the lesser one can come to know the thoughts of the greater, as for the surveillance exercised over private correspondence, it was done with great service according to orders from above and only to throw light on the suspicions of the superior police. The employees of the Foreign Correspondence Department had scruples about this. They loathed having to open domestic correspondence and usually foisted off this task on the second-class employees. Then, too, the emperor was large-minded enough not to grant postal indiscretions more importance than was their due. "Is there nothing more impulsive and emotional than a French pen?" said he. Anyone I've criticized at my levee will write during the day that I am a tyrant. The day before he had heaped me with praises, and the following day he will be ready to give his life for me. I often would have risked losing my best friends had I the weakness to judge them on the gossip in their letters, whereas my enemies always know perfectly well how to present themselves so that they have nothing to fear from this inquisition. Napoleon, after having read the extracts of political and private correspondence, burned everything, wishing to retain from this stolen confidence only the first impression it had made on his mind relative to particular affairs and particular people. Some severities on his part had no other origin in what poorly informed malcontents attributed to prejudice, unkind rivalries, or even treachery. They would more correctly have ascribed to the intemperance of their own pens. Let us add that on more than one occasion, good men who did not suspect it owed an unexpected favor or the successful outcome of some action to this glance which, like a look from the heavens, had in a moment discerned the secret of their soul. I recall a minister of Spain who, owing to his devotion to King Joseph, found himself in great distress in France. The emperor learned the secret of Monsieur d'Azon's position by a letter in which he confided in a friend. Immediately he ordered me to send there 3,000 francs to the faithful Spaniard, and to write him that every month the same sum would be placed at his disposition. This generous action was paid out of Napoleon's own purse. Only the catastrophe of 1814 put an end to this arrangement. Not all the secrets which came via this route were surprises. In this portfolio, there was also unrestricted correspondence which voluntarily chose this method of communication. Napoleon, wishing to know the opinions of the day on the progress of his administration and on his own actions, arranged for amis, who, for an average of 1,000 francs a month, were given the task of writing to him frankly all that was said and done in this regard, as well as what they themselves thought, as they occupied different positions in society and held a wide variety of opinions. Napoleon, in reading them, could get an idea of the differing judgments of which he was the object. Among these correspondents, Monsieur de Montlosier, Monsieur Fievet, and Madame de Genlis have already been identified, and their names are sufficient to indicate how honorable this confidential role was. Monsieur Lavalette's discretion ensured the secrecy of their communications. Monsieur de Renauda, who could also be named, wrote by the intermediary of the Duke of Bassano, Marais. The emperor opened these letters himself and burned them after reading. Above all, he prevented the extracts from the post or the correspondence we have just discussed from falling into the hands of his ministers. When he decided something was worth extracting for them, only our handwriting appeared. From letters, the emperor turned to the newspapers he found gathered in a bundle on the corner of his table. He liked to reread articles in the Moniteur, for which he had taken the trouble to dictate the outline. Nothing escaped his glance, and political concerns did not prevent him from lingering over literary articles in the Empire's newspaper. These various readings gave rise to orders dictated from time to time. "Write," said the emperor each time, raising his voice, and the secretary, leaving at once his present occupation, noted down on folded half-sheets of foolscap, prepared in advance, the more or less hurried words that fell on his ear. At other times, the emperor looked over the lists kept at the palace gates. Each morning, the grand marshal made up a bulletin indicating the names of people from the outside who had presented themselves the previous day and the names of the people inside whom they had asked for. This provided an idea of the habits and relationships that the principal inhabitants of the palace had with the people of the city. Finally, correspondence, reports, and newspapers read, Napoleon would come to sit at his desk. Then he attacked the pile of current affairs, and his work began. He rarely took up a pen. Normally, he wrote in his own hand only to the Empress. The Emperor granted a pension from his private funds to his former writing master, and never was a pension more gratuitous. Napoleon wrote very poorly. The keenness of his mind could not be slowed to the pace of his hand. He traced only half-formed letters and never finished a word or a line, bypassing without a qualm all the rules of spelling. What he wrote ended by being so messy that even he had the greatest difficulty in rereading it. He preferred to dictate. He was accustomed to it and used this method of work with great skill. His dictation seemed to be merely a conversation held out loud in which he addressed himself to his correspondent as though that person were there to hear him. Someone listening at the door would indeed have believed both parties present. Taking down his dictation was the secretary's primary duty. Rarely did he need to write, prepare, or edit, as Napoleon did all that. But he dictated so quickly that the task was a hard one. Few were the pens that could keep pace with him. There was no way to get him to repeat himself. To interrupt him would have been to appear like an intruder in the tete-a-tete of his imagination. His train of thought would have been completely disrupted. It was necessary to keep up at all costs so as not to be too overwhelmed by the sentences that flew past. The trick was to leave appropriate blanks in order to follow the thread of his speech. They could be filled in later when the flurry was over and the sequence of ideas helped to fill in the gaps. But it required knowledge of the subject. This was indispensable to correct misunderstandings, avoid ambiguity, and clearly translate vague expressions. In this sense, it could be said that the secretary was obliged to know as much about current affairs as the emperor himself. On beginning to work, Napoleon started off calmly enough, but little by little became animated. As his mouth warmed to the dictation, Diddy would get up, cross the room in both directions with great strides, and like a pendulum, making the movement of a clock. The frequency of his comings and goings marked the more or less rapid pace of his ideas, and even the turn of his phrases. Finally, when he had reached the main theme, and each day had its own, he became profuse. This theme would later turn up again in all his letters, in all his conversations. The words came back exactly the same, so vividly and deeply had the first impression remained in his thoughts. With him, plucking the same string repeatedly produced the same sound with remarkable accuracy. These set phrases were a great boon to the scribe. He knew them by heart and saw them coming like the refrain of a verse. A symbol was sufficient to mark their place. If the emperor went out of his cabinet, the secretary seized this moment to put the papers on the table in order to gather up all the answered papers with which the floor was strewn. As he picked them up, he scanned them quickly, and this was the best safeguard for what he had just written. In cases of doubt, the terms and circumstances of the request illuminated the true meaning of the reply. The secretary was only too glad to have this means of rectifying information, always difficult to grasp on the wing, such as figures, certain technical terms, and all the names of people and places that Napoleon mangled, sometimes to the point where they were unrecognizable. Sometimes it was the Ebro for the Elbe, sometimes Smolensk for Salamanca, and vice versa. I no longer recall which Polish name he confused with Badajoz in his speech, but I do remember that when he spoke of Hyssop, it meant the fortress of Osopo. When the emperor did not wish to write himself, either because the matter wasn't important enough to warrant it, or because he had reasons of his own for not wishing to enter into a correspondence too direct, he wrote under his secretary's name. Often he dictated a letter beginning with these ritualistic words: "The emperor has asked me, etc." It happened, too, that in urgent cases, when the emperor had not been able to wait, was no longer there to sign a letter, the secretary made note of it at the bottom of the letter where Napoleon's signature would have been, and signed it himself. Each dictation gave rise to the considerable task of recopying, at least 2 and sometimes 3 times. First, a copy to be sent was made. It was always pressing to do this so that it could be signed and expedited. It was written on gold-edged vellum paper in the square shape of stationery, without margins and without paragraph indentations. Next to be taken care of was the record copy, which was to replace the rough draft of the dictation. It was written on loose sheets of foolscap with small margins. There were no record books, no tables, no inventories. That could only have been done by clerks, and the emperor wanted none of it. He said that secrecy and bureaucracy were incompatible. You made up for the ordinary procedures by means of organization and memory. When the emperor had dictated for 2 hours, the secretary had enough work to keep him busy for the rest of the day. He wasn't always able to clean up the notes from the dictations, and the unfolding of the day's affairs caused what was left from yesterday to be recopied, to disappear from view. This explains why many important letters no longer exist for the cabinet's collection, except on the papers full of abbreviations, deletions, blanks, insertions, and reference marks that received the initial dictation, informal drafts in which are buried precious documents that in a few years no one will be able to decipher. The day's first work, interrupted at 9 o'clock by the levee and taken up soon after, ended when the emperor went to lunch.